My previous videos I showed how to get the engine out, how to take the top end off. Now I'm going to show you how to take apart and assemble a crank. So you're going to be taking off the engine brackets. Take the starter off, even though there's only one bolt connecting. You got to take the starter off out of the way. This is the water pump cover. Take that off. Pay attention. They're all 10 millimeter except this one. This is the drain bolt. So you take that off. And then there's not much else. There's a whole bunch of bolts on the bottom. Make sure you get them all off. It's easy to miss them. And then once you get all of those off, once you get all these off, there's a lot of them. Another precaution, I took the oil pump off, even though I didn't need to, but I didn't want it to get damaged. So I took that off, and the only thing holding it, that was this hose. So, and when you go to assemble it, it wouldn't hurt to, you want to put some oil in this. Make sure that's filled up with oil before you put that back on. And then there's another tip is that this also goes to the oil pump. And this is just you open up the screw, and you want to make sure oil comes out and no air. That's to help to bleed the oil system after you get everything back together. So once you get all the bolts out, double check you got all the bolts out. Get a rubber mallet, 2x4, and just pound on this. Make sure you pound on it in secure places. And then I'm going to put my phone down and take this off. And that's what we're up to next. So in this case, this had a bad rod bearing, and now things get real expensive. Fortunately, I was finding a really nice used one, but a lot of shops will not work on this because the pins, let's see if we can see it, the pins are welded, and a lot of machine shops will not work on these because of the pin is these pins are welded. So just to get to that, one of the choices was a remanufactured one for it's like would have been about $800. So that's what you're in for. All my other bearings were fine, and where you think it's an overheating problem. But once you get a new crank or some type of crank, let's see, things to check out for it. The seals should be going to that lip there, and there's a round hole, this notch right there. I'm going to take this out. There are, let's see, there's these clips here. So these clips, I'm just backtracking, only need to go on halfway. And then when you put it in, when you put the bearings in, you just need about 2/3 of this clip down in there. So there's a clip for this bearing, and they kind of go in like that. Now there's notches. You see these pins on here, these little pins right here. There are, let's see, where am I? Okay, hold on, let's get everything back up there. Alright, so that little indentation there is supposed to rest on that pin right there, and there's an indentation on each of these bearings that goes in there. Now these little pins right there, they're supposed to go in here. So you want to put the crank on the upper half of the case. Let it rest in, and you're going to have to eyeball it to make sure the seal is in Make sure this, because they don't stick up very much. So turn the bearing around, make sure that's seated in place. And then make sure these pins are all in place. Is that these pins here? Some of these bearings, they don't have these pins. They just have the indentation. So once it's in, and make sure that these clips are about like that. And you want to pre-oil everything, all the bearings. Make sure everything's nice and oiled and lubed up before you put it in. Now the manual says to fill this with oil, with 2-stroke oil. But the problem with that is the crankshaft is in place on the top half. You know, all the notches are only on the top half. So you've got the crank in place. So if you, the ideal way is to take this and to put the cover on like that. And of course, that oil's going to spill all out. So I just made sure I had everything nice and oiled up. You can also check your water pump bearings and your seals. There's like zero play on that. This also not only turns the water pump, but it turns the oil pump too. So now, once you get all that crank in place, this is what I use. Motor seal, gasket maker. You want to make sure your surface is nice and clean. First I used brake clean, and I just use a razor to clean off all the old stuff. And then I used alcohol to make sure to get rid of the brake clean. And then this is supposed to be applied to each surface. And so you apply a bead of it, and then you smooth it out with your finger all the way around. They said let it dry for a minute, but the problem is it's going to take you about 3 minutes to apply everything. You apply everything on both surfaces, let it dry for a minute, and then put everything back together. Make sure that these locating pins are in place. Make sure those are in place. And then once you put everything back together, you put this top on. Then there are sequences. And here's that sequence right there. Here's the numbers. A lot of it's just common sense. So you start with, let's see. Yeah, so you start with this number sequence right here. You do all those. You start at about 9 foot-pounds, then finalize at 19, and then there's 6 more bolts there. And then I let it dry overnight before doing anything else. And then you're ready for assembly. And I think I covered everything. So I didn't take my reed cages off. This engine doesn't have very low miles. And once I got it back together, I made sure. Well, actually, before you put everything back together, just rotate the crank. It's easier to put the nut back on this shaft if you have to move things around. This is where the stator goes. So just trying to make sure it rotates. Make sure you don't hear any clicking, no binding. It should run very smoothly. And then once you put it back together, get everything back together, do a compression test, and then I added a little bit of gas to each cylinder before I fired it up, and it's running great.